During our demonstration, what we'll be taking a specific look at is we'll be setting up a shared category. Then we'll create a project category. And then after we create our project category, we'll review where that category is available, and then we'll review some of the other category specific setup. There are a few parameters and other areas that we'll take a look at. Okay, so we're looking at the workspace homepage here. And what we're going to be doing is setting up a project category. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'll back up here as I'll click on the hamburger, and we're going to go to project management and accounting. And then in the setup area is where you can set up your project categories. So the first thing to note is we're going to be under the category node here, or folder, or whatever you want to call it, menu. And underneath there's three forms that we can visit. So if you remember back to the last diagram that we looked at around the structure of a project category, we can set up shared categories, we can set up category groups, and we can set up project categories. So the first thing that we'll do here is we'll set up a shared category. So within this form, basically all you're doing is you're selecting the new button, and then you'll type your category ID. It can be, it's a string, so it can be numeric, alphabetic, doesn't matter. And we'll call ours administration. Now this is where you can say, well, what modules will be using this shared category? And this is where we'll say, all right, well, we just want to expose it to our project module. But if you want to expose it to the expense module or the production module, you can. And notice that, for example, if I select the expense module, other functionality exists. So you have to define then what the expense type is if it's in the expense module. If you're interested in this type of functionality, there's an expense management course out there for you to review. But we'll be focusing on the project area, so we're just going to release it to the project module, and I'm going to give it a name as well, which I'll say is administration. All right, so we'll save that. So now if I actually jumped into any other legal entity and went to the shared categories form, you'll see this administration module. So this form right here is a global form, so any company within Dynamics AX has access to it. So I'll save, and we'll just jump over to the next step. So typically the next step would be, if you're starting from ground zero, is that you have to have a category group. So if we just jump into the category group form, basically here's all the different groupings I have in the USSI company within the Contoso demo data set. And if we wanted to, we could create a new category group, and let's do so. We'll just call it, go labor. And notice that first thing you have to add is that category group ID, basically, and you can give it a numeric or an alphabetic label if you want. But the second thing that you have to define is what transaction type. So remember back to when we talked about transaction type, the thing that sticks out in your mind here should be that, okay, well, what documents within AX do I want to see these categories? What documents do they need to work with? And since this is a labor category, we'll just pick hours. So when we have timesheets and hours journals, these are the categories that will be used. So we'll call it labor group. And then you can give it a default line property, and notice there's two other tabs too, the cost accounts and revenue accounts. So if you want to define ledger accounts with each one of these different posting types, you definitely can. We'll get into that a little downstream. Now let's say we have a default line property of billable as well. So anytime I create a category that's underneath this category group, it will inherit that default line property. Okay, so we have a shared category. We just created a category group. Now we can go in and actually create a project category. So to create a project category, you go back to setup and then categories and then project categories. And I mentioned that this is almost like a release process. Like when we create the project category, we're releasing it to the specific legal entity, and it can have legal entity specific settings. So if we hit the new button and we look in here, we can see there's my administration category that I added. So I have to select it. You can't type in anything here. And this is a lot of questions that I used to get on this form was, Well, I hit new and then I type in test and, oh, it looks like there was test. I'll just type in Tom. And then if I tab off, let's try that again. Tom, and then once I pick a category group and try and save the record, you get the error. The category ID Tom does not exist in shared categories. Create the category in shared categories first. So the prerequisite is that shared categories, and you can't create a project category without that category group. So 2 prerequisites. So now let's try again and create our admin category. And notice that you can also toggle on or off the checkboxes for use in expense or use in production if you want to from here as well. But now we'll pick our category group, and this is how it's defining what business documents or what transaction type it can be used with. And then after that, you have a bunch of information that you can fill out about the category. What the default items sales tax group is. If you want to define one of those, you definitely can. If you're looking to use the estimation functionality, you have to have specific categories for that, and you can toggle that on. But if you toggle that on, it has to be of fee type, and we'll talk about that later. Subscription as well, that's for fee type categories. And then there's indirect component and absence toggles that we'll talk about later. The primary ones that I want you to look at for now is this active in journals. So do you want this project category to be active in journals? And this doesn't just reflect journals, it reflects all business documents. So we want this to be active. And there's actually a project parameter that you have to toggle on to make this functionality work. And it's a best practice to have active in journals active, meaning that if you toggle this as a no, that it will not be able to be picked from a drop-down when you have to select a category on a transaction. And then finally, we have the default, and you can see that you can pick billable or non-billable. But if you don't pick anything, then it's going to pull from your category group. And in this case, I mean billable. I'll just leave it as is. And then once again, at the category level, you can specify all the different posting types. And when I say posting types, it's just the labels for each one of these sections, and then you can define a count under each one of these. And there is basically another form, a master form, where you can do all this rather than going into each category to set this all up, and we'll talk about that later. So I'll hit save. And before we go use this administrative category, we're going to jump into the project parameters and just take a look at the category specific parameters that we called out. So I'm going to be under project management and accounting, setup, and then the first menu in here is project management and accounting parameters. We'll select that. And then under the general tab, I believe that's where it's at. Oh, nope, it's not here. It's going to be under journals then. There it is. So under journals, then it's include in journal lookup. So you can see that there's 2 options. There's inactive categories. So we want this toggled as yes. So that toggle that we can trigger on the category is in play. If you had this toggled to no, all categories would show whether you have them active or not. So we want that yes, and then terminated workers, that's if you have workers that have been terminated. Do you want them to show on the list of workers? Yes, we probably want that as a no. Now I'll just leave it as is. Okay, so now if we go back and take a look at, let's just do a quick journal of some sort. I'll do an hours journal. And once we're in this hours journal, basically we'll just be creating a header and then going into the lines of the journal to add specific lines. All right, so now I'm just going to add a new journal. And then I'll go to the lines. There we go, and then we'll add a new line. So the first thing that we'll note is that there's a few required fields, right? There's the project ID, have to define that. And you can see that there is a default category value populated, and that's something that we didn't talk about and I'd like to talk about. So basically when you go into any business document that's associated with the transaction type that you're working with, so in our case we're working with labor, so we went into an hours journal, and there's parameters that you can where you can set up the default category. And you can also set the default category up on a specific resource as well. But what we'll notice here is if I scroll up, there's my administration category, and I can select that in the list here. If I had that active in journal switch to off, I wouldn't be seeing this administration category within here. So basically you can pick your category, and then you can go in, define how many hours, and then on the general tab we'll see all the cost rate and the sales price associated with that specific category combination there. There's other factors that can go into that. But yeah, so that's how you see your categories, and you always have to define them. Let's go back and look at the parameters real quick. So I'll just jump back into the parameters form. And on the journals section as well, it's going to be on the journals tab. There's your default category setup. And just be 1 second here for this thing to process. There we go. And then on the journals tab, you can see here's your default journal names, but then the second one is your default categories. So for hours, the hours transaction type, you can see that PM is the default. So a lot of, and the majority of the implementations that I've been part of, we don't have defaults in here. And the reason being is because we want user interaction when they're entering their time cards. Unless you have static project categories, I mean, you want your users defining what the categorization of work they're doing is, and the way to force that is to not default anything in. But in our case, we had defaults, and that's fine. So that's just a quick overview of project categories. Hopefully you understand how to create them and now how to define them at a transaction level as well.